Exactly. Yep.
Late shoes.
Welcome to the BTS Presents show.
Hi, I'm Candace Bradfield, broker and owner of Bradfield & Associates, and past president of our Santa Cruz County Association of Realtors. I want to thank you for joining BTS Presents. We're going to be talking about the Santa Cruz County and Silicon Valley real estate.
Hello and welcome to our housing affordability discussion. I'm Datta Khalsa and I have panelists Cruz and Cynthia, who are both city council members, as well as some housing advocates, Viveka and Justin. Thanks all for joining us, and fellow realtor Rosemary McNair, generally very well educated on a lot of the county issues. So we're here, I think everybody agrees, unless they're not paying attention to the news, that housing affordability is amongst the toughest situations in our county and statewide. Our county has, the last homeless population I saw, and Chris, you're probably up to date on this, I saw it reported was 2249.
For the county.
For the county.
1,400 in the city.
And 1,400 in the city, compared to a population of 274 in the county. I think the city is at what, 65,000?
274,000.
Yes, 274,000 in the county and 65,000 I think in the city. 25% of the homeless are actually working homeless. These are people really trying to make a living and just can't find housing. So it's a very serious issue. At the same time, as realtors, Rosemary and I, there are heartbreaking story after heartbreaking story of families that just can't afford to buy a place. I think in Silicon Valley it takes $373,000 a year of income to be able to buy a house now, an average house. And in Santa Cruz, our affordability index is something in the range of about 16-17%. Rosemary, what's your perception on the issue here?
Well, as I have been in the county since 1976, I watched an evolution that occurred. A lot of projects began and were sort of shrunk down. They never seemed to come out exactly with the density that they talked about. Very rarely did I see any apartments built over all these years. There was a large amount of housing that occurred that was mostly single family, and a few condos and so on and so forth. Back in '76, Gary Patton really designed and was the initiator of inclusionary zoning for affordable housing. And that affordable housing component was designed as a percentage, and many of the developments that were under a subdivision, which a major subdivision is 5 units, then the developer would, in a way, give one of them toward the affordable component. If they did 4 houses, they didn't have to give one away, so it cost the developer less. So actually they would defer down and do the 4. When they tried to raise it up higher, the developers completely walked away. So it was like, it sounds good to say we're going to have 25% affordable housing, but then we couldn't get anybody to step up to the plate and do it. So we would go back to the 15%. I agree completely with what everyone is saying about how difficult it is to find housing. The point I would like to make is creating the rent control requirement on it is not going to increase supply. Everyone who's there now will still be there, and those who still want a place that is affordable, it doesn't create more housing.
Since we have 2 rental advocates here who are actually putting forth the signatures for putting this on the ballot, does either of you want to speak to that? So the question is on the table, since it doesn't add supply, how would it create a long-term solution?
I think that the one way it helps is that it allows for the current tenants to actually have some security in their ability to stay in the house that they're in, right? Is it going to create more supply? No, and that's a completely separate issue, though. working with the city to figure out a way for developers to be able to develop more housing is a separate issue outside of the rent control campaign.
And more traffic. There's always that question too. So
that also comes along with the rent control campaign. So if more people are allowed to stay and live in Santa Cruz and work in Santa Cruz, that reduces the amount of people who are going to have to move out of Santa Cruz and then commute into Santa Cruz to live. So I think that that's one of the big parts of the rent control measure that is actually going to help kind of keep down some of the traffic and allow people to stay in the homes that they're currently in.
Okay, and Cynthia, I was at a discussion that you did, that you presented to the WCR last week, and you got a standing ovation almost for the comment that you're putting forth the limit on UCSC, a cap on the student enrollment of 19,400, I think, or 19,500. You want to speak a little bit more to what steps you're proposing be done with that?
Sure. Actually, well, myself and Councilmember Krohn and Councilmember Matthews actually brought that forward on our last agenda, and it's essentially asking, again, the community to weigh in on a referendum that'll be on the ballot to say to the UC Regents, which is really where the mandate comes from, and to our legislators to a certain extent, we're at our max, and we really can't, at this point, help support additional students in the city with the current infrastructure that we have. And to be clear, and I think this was a point that was made earlier, it's not about not supporting the university. I mean, I was a student there, Chris works there, you were a student there, you're a student there. I don't know your history, but a lot of times folks here are somehow engaged with the university. The university brings incredible benefits to the community, and we also in the city, and also the county too, has had incredible burdens in terms of housing and trying to find, to figure out how we're going to balance that. So we've said we want the city to vote on this, the constituents, to send a message to the regents that they need to find another solution.
We have history that shows, I think it was from 1980, 1979, Oakland, Berkeley, San Francisco all passed rent control. And for the next 15 years, there was a huge drop in the supply. We will represent a property owner and say, okay, it's time to sell this thing. Typically what happens is, okay, well, let's get the rents up now. We've been nice to the tenants, and let's get it worth what it's worth. I had a specific case on Beach Hill, a Victorian duplex, beautiful thing. It's on the cover of the walking tour. That is worth, when I did the comps last year as a duplex, it was worth pretty much what it would be worth as 2 units, whether they were owner occupied or not, or if one family occupied the whole thing. This time, surprisingly, because of the rent freeze, because they're the nice landlords, they're actually the value based on gross rent multiplier doesn't pencil out selling as a duplex, and so it'll most likely get bought by a Silicon Valley person with money and moved into as a home, and we're going to lose 2 housing units with that one. And on a large scale, that apparently happened in Oakland, in Berkeley, in San Francisco. An estimated 10,000 rental units were lost, largely because of the formation of TICs. Owners would basically, groups of owners would say, hey, great, we're going to buy, we can't find housing, we're going to buy these units. And the owner of the unit said, well, if I can sell it to owners and it's worth more than it is as units, then as long as we're selling to owners, we're okay. And then those tenants were out of luck. So today, flash forward, San Francisco has an estimated homeless population of 7,500 people. That's 11% of the population. I've been up there, I've stepped over the homeless people while I'm trying to go to people's grocery. And they're also very dense. They have the traffic. So I wonder if building more ADUs answers the question. So it's really complex, and I'm concerned personally because I see it happen historically, and I wonder if we're doomed to repeat it. So how are you guys reconciling all those things? Chris, I guess you have some limited time, so let's turn to you.
Datta, thanks. First of all, the housing market's out of control.
No question.
For me, I completely reject what you just said about, oh, somebody's going to want to sell their property and they want to get the rents up. I mean, from a tenant's perspective, that's gouging. That's not a good thing from our perspective. You're living in this bubble that most people in Santa Cruz do not live in. Most people don't own property. There's 58% renters.
Well, no, if you owned the property and you had a choice to sell it for $1.6 million as a duplex or $2.2 million as a single-family residence, you're going to sell it for a single-family residence. And we're going to lose, thanks to the rent freeze, we're going to lose 2 units of rental housing that would have penciled out.
You want to work for the people, your constituents who are living here now, not the future people who are going to move into that house. And I think the rent freeze is a way to hold off raising rents until this this petition works its way through, and see if they get enough signatures. If they don't, by September 1st, the rent freeze is off. If they do, it'll probably be in December when the final totals come into the city council, whether that works or not.
Which one's idea was the rent freeze? Did you bring it forward, or who got that rent freeze in?
Vice Mayor Watkins, myself,
Okay.
and Councilmember Brown.
And Brown, okay. So I have a math question. So you've got the gouging landlord who's charging $3,000 for a 2-bedroom, and you have the nice landlord who's charging, let's say, $1,800 for that. They each are in the process of thinking about they're going to sell their property. As a realtor, I have to tell the person with the $3,000 unit, your property is worth approximately 40% more than this other nice person. You've seemingly rewarded the mean landlord and punished the nice landlord. So how do we reconcile that?
I mean, Santa Cruz County rents, rates
City.
of housing, the city, you're already getting a huge return on what you're selling your property for right now. I mean, if you bought late and you bought recently, I mean, that's another thing. It's like if you bought recently, you expect to have these rents that are crazy rents, and you go, oh, well, that doesn't pencil out. I have to rent these 3 units for X amount of dollars because that's what my mortgage is. But, that's your problem.
So if we take an average, you've got a 2-bedroom apartment rented for $3,000. You've got a 2-bedroom apartment rented for $1,800. The average between those is about $2,400, let's say. Now this one gets sold to a Silicon Valley person who wants to occupy it and pay more money than it would sell for as a rental, and you have 120 days or whatever the process is that you've discussed about notifications and move-out periods. Now suddenly your average has shot up to $3,000, and all you're left with is these high, and we saw it happen in San Francisco. So I'm concerned. I want to find a solution as much as anybody. I, as a property owner, would be willing to pay a tax to support affordable housing for core components like teachers, like nurses, like, I mean, the people that our society needs.
Have the real estate people brought that forward to the city council? Because we're happy to entertain that. It'd be a great initiative.
I would say that would be a much more responsible discussion than rent control, because again, I don't want to reward the bad landlords or the price gouging landlords, if there is such a thing, and there are, and hurt the nice landlords and basically force them to sell off. I mean, 10,000 housing units between the foremost TIC attorney in the world Andy Serkin, lives in the Bay Area. And he built his business based on this model, because apartment houses, nobody would maintain them. They would go down in value because their rents were worth that, and they would sell them to groups of TIC buyers who essentially get to move in as a condo. And if you have 10 units, all buyers move in, you got 10 less places to rent. Rents have actually risen more in the Bay Area than they have here. And they have rent control. So it's concerning to me. And I run property management. I run, I help people buy properties. I see both sides of the thing, and I have clients and friends who rent. So I really do want to find a solution. I'm equally motivated. So, I mean, maybe the tenant representatives here could speak a little bit more to their thoughts on what you think can solve it and how you think rent control could do it. Because I personally have real concerns based on what happened in San Francisco. We have history right there.
Sure. So I'd love to talk about that. So what you're talking about is the history with what's happened in previous cases where rent control has been implemented. And so it's true that actually across the country during the time period you're talking about, the 70s and the 80s, that there was a depression in the available housing stock, but that happened in places that were both rent controlled and not rent controlled, right? So we don't have an authoritative answer, I would say, on what actually caused that depression in available housing. And I guess we can talk speculatively about what may or may not happen with landlords withdrawing their properties once rent control is implemented. But I can tell you this for a fact: if rent control is implemented, it will stabilize the housing crisis. It will provide that 25% of Santa Cruz residents some desperately needed relief, who are really deeply concerned about being displaced right now. We know that for a fact as long as the law is implemented, which we have every reason to think it will be if it's passed. it will provide that solution. That's a guarantee. Now, all questions about what developers will do, what property owners will do in terms of buying and selling are speculative. We actually just don't know how, for a fact, that they'll respond, but we do know that rent control will keep people in their homes, and they really badly need that right now.
So let's follow that. That person stays in their home. They're going to UCSC. They've got a rent-controlled unit. They graduate. They get an income of $300,000, $200,000, whatever you can get in Silicon Valley. What's their incentive to leave that and free it up for somebody, a homeless person right outside who could really use that unit, and they're suddenly profiting from it? Or what's stopping them from, and this happens in San Francisco, I saw it posted on Nextdoor Live Oak. They're in a rent-controlled unit. They're subletting to their roommates, gouging their roommates, and they're living free while the landlord doesn't get any of this, is paying the property tax. Is that fair to the tenants, I mean the subtenants? Is that fair to the homeless people outside who could use housing? And they have like six-figure incomes.
So what I would say is that it's not an issue of like competition between tenants, right? Because for tenants, rent control is good for all of us. The inclusion of more affordable housing, a greater percentage point of affordable housing is always going to be a good thing for us. A lot of people say, oh, well, it's not fair if you have a protected class of tenants. That's just an argument that says the problem with rent control is that there isn't enough rent control. We agree. We would love for all units that are being rented. I mean, I personally would love for all units that are rented out to be subject to fair price controls, because that's what it would take for us to really guarantee all people a place to live in this society.
It's a great utopian vision. I think it's dangerous, yeah.
I want to join my comments with yours about UCSC before, because I do think that they are driving rental housing rates up in the city artificially, because if you have to pay $1,400, $1,500 to live in, you have a triple, and all three people are paying, $1,400 or $1,500, which is anybody can find this out. Just go to UCSC dorm rates, and you'll see
it's well known. And UCSC is not rent controlled, right? They're exempt, as I understand
they're
it.
not under rent control, and I've heard some students say that maybe we should do rent control on campus, and call the university a landlord, and play the same thing out, because that's what's happening in town, and they are really, hurting our rental market as well. And I'll say that there's a three-legged stool here. There's the vacation rental group, there's Silicon Valley, and there's the UCSC students, and I see it as like a stool with the community, maybe sitting on top of at the bottom. I don't know which way the stool is going. I would like to see rent control on the ballot so people can vote that up or down, and we can move on with various discussions. I do think if it does make it to the ballot, there'll be a huge debate and lots of discussions. Of course, the Apartment Renters Association will come in with all their money and try to dissuade people, but I think it's fair game.
It could be that there will become tenants against rent control if they learn the truth and really research it. Maybe the research says something else, because it could be that the very thing that you're trying to do might hurt people. Because we have homeless people in San Francisco. These people, I don't know about this protected class of tenant when landlords have a disincentive to even allow them to keep it as a rental unit, and suddenly that rental unit's pulled off the market. I've had 3 property owners say they want to sell their houses since the rent freeze happened, and that concerns me, because I have a lot of friends, I have employees who are tenants, and if that place gets sold out from under them and bought by somebody to occupy it, that's 3 less people we're going to have housing for.
I'd like to throw another rental inspection ordinance thing in here too, because I've had many people tell me they don't even rent their property anymore because they have to deal with the city. And
I have to jump in here. I've got to say something about the supply of housing and why the supply is so stunted, which is causing, the fact that we have the supply is causing the quest to find something to do with the pricing. The pricing for sales are ridiculous, the multiple offers, all of that, it's a kind of a fake thing because of the supply that we don't have. You start with apartments, we need some more apartments, obviously.
But how can people who live here now afford any of that market rate housing? They can't afford it.
If you could find a way to first build apartments, and every tenant that gets in that apartment building is incentivized. After a period of time, like 6 months or whatever, they get a compensation, and it can be through affordable money that comes from the state or the feds or whatever it comes from a tax, who knows. And that money gets put into their own savings account to move up to, say, a condo that they could buy, and so on and so forth. To the extent that you're creating a different kind of affordable housing thing. Some of the affordable housing guidelines in Measure O, Measure J, Watsonville, all of them, are draconian for people to either it's 1 inch from the goal line and they can't make it because of something that doesn't work. They don't have enough children to match up to the size of the house or something to qualify for the income guidelines for HDD and all that stuff. I'm saying change that whole game plan and not make it so stringently ridiculous for people. Everybody says, oh, we can't build, we don't have the land, we don't have the water. I think if we have the brilliant people that we have, because some of this old stuff needs to be strafed and something nice put there that you guys could live in and buy someday.
Can you speak a little bit to the just cause eviction ordinance that you basically, in the rental freeze, has that component to it? So what was the thinking in that?
Really, that was going hand in hand with the freeze so that during that period of time people were protected. I mean, this whole rent freeze and just cause that are going together is so that the community can engage in a conversation around
So do you want to talk about there's only very few exempt classes of people that the just cause eviction doesn't apply to. So
I don't know it by heart, and
Okay.
I didn't bring the materials
Okay.
to talk through that. There is a fact sheet on the city's website that goes through who it applies to and who it doesn't, and I actually refer people to that all the time. I never quote it because it's really pretty detailed, and it's
Yeah.
really important that people look at that. If you're a renter, if you're a landlord, if you're just curious about this, that's really the best place to go to.
Okay.
I do have to excuse myself, but this is a really good conversation, and I appreciate Rosemary's points about thinking about affordability differently. And I think that there are a lot of things that were suggested as part of the housing listening sessions that we need to look at things differently. And we need to create incentives for people to be homeowners, because I'm not a homeowner either. And my husband and I have been looking for a very long time, and we both have jobs. I have 2 full-time jobs. And additional other part-time jobs, and still we're trying to scrape together to continue to stay here
Yeah.
to a city that I'm clearly very committed to. So I think this is the point where we need to put almost everything on the table.
having government, having tenants, having people in the housing industry.
Yep.
I mean, we can hopefully figure out we're on the same side of things and stop vilifying and saying, oh, those horrible landlords and those horrible tenants.
Yep.
It's a human issue. It impacts everybody. You know, we're not sociologists, we're not city engineers, but it's on our government and our tenant advocates and our housing professionals to try and figure it out, because we're all impacted by it.
Yeah.
And all humans. So I appreciate all of you guys sharing. And again, more discussion if you want to engage. Create a some sort of a group that meets regularly. I'm happy to give my insights, not in an argumentative, but purely exploratory, giving my facts, my insights, because I'd hate to see you guys make a mistake. If it's like a bunch of lemmings running off a cliff with these, rent control now signs, and they don't look and see what happened in 1980 to 1995, or if there's a way we could change that, why isn't there means testing?
We can't just talk about it in a hyperbolic way. It has to
Right.
be something that has definitive answers to the numbers and the
Okay,
reasons.
well, I'd just like to speak about a couple of things that have come up
Yes.
thematically in this conversation. So first, this, question of, what will happen to the nice landlords versus the greedy landlords. And I guess I'm here to say that I don't want my access to affordable housing to be contingent on whether or not someone chooses in their goodwill to price it something below market. I, as a tenant, deserve to have somewhere affordable to live. It shouldn't be based on whether someone else decided that they wanted to be kind to me. That's putting my quality of life at the whims of whether or not someone else wants to help me out. That's not the same thing as actually having the right. And the second point for me is the question of supply and demand, right? I mean, housing isn't, I'm paraphrasing a UC Berkeley professor as I say this, housing isn't like eBay where supply and demand are immediately going to respond to one another. So even if it were hypothetically possible that we were building thousands and thousands and thousands of units to make a dent in the kind of demand that there exists now, it would take years for that to actually happen. Was people are being displaced now. The time to build out housing was 20 years ago. We need rent control because people are getting evicted every day, and this is a community desperately crying out for some relief.
I think that landlords have an opportunity. You brought this example of somebody graduates from UCSC, they go over the hill, they start making $350,000, and they're renting out they're subletting their rental space to other people, and they're cutting their landlord out. That's illegal. And if someone is doing that, and the landlord should be following up with them to make sure that they're not doing that. I mean, that's something they can stipulate within the lease, is that a tenant should not be subletting the spaces within the place that they're renting out.
You might want to read the just cause eviction ordinance.
I just did, actually.
And they actually
Aren't you one of the
don't they
authors of
protect?
that?
I thought-
I'm one of the
Okay.
supporters, and I work on the campaign.
But weren't there limits on landlords being able to end a lease on time, and landlords specifically not being allowed to allow subletting? So I think subletting under the proposed rules is actually going to get easier for these tenants to do, and with no means testing, there's nothing illegal about
the
it.
subletting portion of the rent control says that the tenant needs to write if they're going to sublet their room or their space, and that the occupancy rate of the house can't exceed whatever the minimum standard is for the city. The landlord has to respond to them and agree or disagree whether or not they approve of that sublet. And I can see a potential position where that might come into play. For example, as a research biologist, there are times when we have to go into the field, and we're going to be gone for 3 to 4 months. But we don't want to lose our place. We don't want to have to, every single time we leave, put our stuff into storage. So if we can write our landlords and have a reason why we should be able to sublet our room while we're gone, I think that that's fine. And then it's up to the discretion of the landlord to approve or disapprove of that need to sublet.
Well, I'd love to engage with you, sometime in the next week or two, to give you my insight on where I am concerned for abuse, because I don't like when people work the system when there's really legitimate needy people that need that. So I think making sure that's done right, it's so hard to do because nobody can figure out everything.
So my last point is that there is that hypothetical situation of someone graduating and getting this nice 6-figure job over the hill, but there's also many more people who work within the service industry and who work in Santa Cruz, the teachers, the firemen, the police officers, the doctors, who aren't going to see that much money. And we need something to protect us, because right now, what we've been seeing is that more and more people are getting displaced. And if this wasn't happening, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now.
So I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up. It's amazing how quickly 25 minutes can go by. I really like this kind of discussion where no one's attacking, everyone's offering ideas and questioning, because questions are really important to ask before you do something. So let's keep it going. And thank you very much for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion. And thank you guys for joining us here.
Yeah, thank you very much.